If you lose Russell Wilson, you need a backup quarterback because Justin Fields will most likely be the starter in 2025. And we'll, still wait on what's going to happen there. But chances are the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to make Justin Fields their starter, especially if Russ leaves. Russ goes to Vegas. I think that's the second part of this is Russ leaves or you start to get the momentum that Russ is gone. Your sense of urgency for Justin goes through the roof. It becomes, no one can wait around for this anymore. You have to sign Justin Fields before you find yourself looking at guys like Daniel Jones or Gardner Minshew or whoever out there going, it's the best we've got right now. That's not, at that point, go trade back for Kenny Pickett and make it happen there. But it's the sense of urgency skyrockets the second Russ leaves the organization. But there were two names that emerged over the weekend as potential backups for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The first one, familiar face for the Pittsburgh Steelers, a friend, an old quarterback who turned into a starter, whose journey in Pittsburgh, man, if you told me he left and there's any chance he's coming back, I'd tell you there's zero chance he's coming back. Pigs would fly before this guy stepped foot in the Pittsburgh Steelers facility once again for a third time. That guy started his career as a third-round pick. He was hated, or at least strongly disliked, by the starting quarterback who was supposed to turn him into the next guy after that starting quarterback. Was eventually promised a shot, not once, but twice. Didn't get either of them realistically. And ended up being the starting quarterback that led the Pittsburgh Steelers into the playoffs, benching and ending the career in a Steelers uniform for the guy that they drafted to be the next franchise quarterback. Wild times for none other than Mason Rudolph, who Jerry Dulac says could be an option for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Looking for a new gig after Tennessee. Went 1-4 as a starter this season, but come on. Can anybody win in Tennessee? I have a hard time believing so. Mason didn't look absolutely terrible. Definitely didn't look good, but he looked good at the end of his Pittsburgh Steelers tenure. Maybe they're thinking, that's a guy that comes back. There were guys in that locker room, I know this for certain, that wanted Mason to return in 2025 or 2024, that were hoping Mason Rudolph got the starting job for another season because they believed that he was capable of leading this team. Okay, great. The other option is a guy that on Friday, maybe it was Thursday, some point last week, you made the joke. He's just going to have to eventually sign with the Bengals if this is what happens. Well, maybe it does happen. According to Tony Pauline, Joe Flacco is a name to watch for the Pittsburgh Steelers, a name that is circulating around three teams right now. The Pittsburgh Steelers, the New England Patriots, and the San Francisco 49ers, all as a backup. He's 40 years old. He threw for 12 touchdowns and 7 interceptions, I believe, this season for the Indianapolis Colts, eventually replaced Anthony Richardson. Then Anthony Richardson replaced him. Not totally sure, but 2 years ago, the Cleveland Browns led him to the playoffs and looked damn good in the process. Beat DeMar Hamlin, who should have never in a billion years lost comeback player of the year, 4 comeback player of the year. That's how impressive he was in Cleveland. Joe Flacco is the other name. Those two names have popped up, and yeah, they're not super exciting, but man, are they worth talking about. Mason, Joe, I think the clear favorite is Mason. I have a hard time believing you would sit here and say, go sign 40-year-old Joe Flacco. But do you have thoughts? I got a lot, but I want to hear yours.
Yeah, I think of the two, I would lean towards Mason Rudolph. One, because Joe Flacco's fine. We saw Joe Flacco firsthand this season. He took out the Pittsburgh Steelers when they were in a game where they should have probably won, right? Yes. They couldn't handle Joe Flacco. They couldn't handle the change of pace between Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco. But I think at the same time, you look at what Mason Rudolph was able to do with the Steelers. I understand 1-4 with Tennessee. You're judging that as a backup going into a starting role on a team that ended up as a whole becoming the team that's going to pick first overall in this year's NFL draft. Yes. You look at what he did with the Steelers. He was 8-4-1 over his long tenure, but specifically last year, whenever you're called upon, you come in with very much a similar team and you win 3 games in a row. You do that. You take them to the playoffs. You give them, I would say, of the last couple of years, probably their best shot to win a playoff game up in Buffalo. I think one of the better performances we've seen out of a quarterback in the playoffs in the last handful of seasons was from Mason Rudolph. So I don't hate that as a backup. I think if you're talking starter, I don't even start the conversation. But when you're starting to talk, who's going to back up Justin Fields or who's going to back up whoever the Steelers go with, I think Mason Rudolph's a name that would make a lot of sense. And honestly, inside that locker room, inside the decision makers' heads of the Pittsburgh Steelers, it makes a lot of sense. Whether or not Mason would want to come back is a completely different question. I mean, if he wrote a book about his first stint with Pittsburgh, it would be a New York Times bestseller. At the very least, it would be an Allegheny River bestseller. Everybody in Pittsburgh would buy it because everybody wants to know, hey, what the heck happened to this guy? He was supposed to be the heir apparent, and then he ended up being somebody who's almost chased out of town, and then he finally redeemed himself, and when he redeemed himself, it was too late, and they sent him out of town anyway. But I think of the two, obviously, I'm going to lean Mason Rudolph. I just think that there's a higher level of play left in Mason Rudolph than there is in Joe Flacco. But at the same time, you could do a lot worse than Joe Flacco in the backup quarterback market.
I 100% agree. Joe Flacco would not be my pick. Wouldn't he be second, third, maybe fifth on my list? But I think you could be way worse than Joe Flacco. I mean, you could go into the NFL draft and pick some names that could be real bad as your backup quarterback. And Joe Flacco is not terribly low on my list. Mason Rudolph is high. Mason Rudolph's high on my list. I could see Mason Rudolph as Charlie Batch. I could see Mason Rudolph as like a real late career Byron Leftwich. Why not? A guy who sticks around for a couple of years, finishes his career in Pittsburgh as a backup, is able to be, he's the ultimate professional. Mason has been through hell in the city of Pittsburgh and within that Pittsburgh Steelers locker room, and he has always handled himself correctly every single time in every single scenario. He is great with young quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett praised the hell out of Mason Rudolph and how much he helped his develop. They're still friends, according to Mitch Trubisky. They still have a group text between the three of them, which is probably a lot of like, hey, Kenny, shout out, congrats on the Super Bowl. Steelers suck. But I would imagine that they're still that close because of the development and the relationship that they built within there. If you have Justin Fields, you want a backup who could help him grow. That's Mason Rudolph. The guys love him, and he's reliable when he steps in. I mean, he had a winning record in Pittsburgh. He was 8-4-1 as a starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's not terrible. The game that he tied against the Lions, I get it. That's the worst game you could possibly have of any team. But he was announced as the starter like 6 hours before the game because Ben all of a sudden wasn't able to go. That's like you have an excuse there. I think Mason's not the worst option in the world. I think he's a pretty good one, to be honest with you. I don't know if he'd want to come back to the Steelers, but I also don't know where his options will be this offseason. Like, who's going to go out and be like, Mason Rudolph's our guy. Let's go sign Mason. Somebody will, obviously. There will be names that go out there and say, Mason's a good quarterback. Let's go get Mason Rudolph. But if you're the Steelers, bring him back to an offense where he understands his role. I think that's the best part here. I'd lure Mason in on a 2-year deal, give you some stability. If those 2 years work out, great. Here's another one. You don't have to worry about a rookie quarterback, or if you do, you go get a rookie quarterback with no expectations of him being the backup. If you're going to go get a Jackson Dart, if you're going to go get a Will Howard, if whoever, I don't think Jalen Milroe is being a QB3, but they're a QB3 in 2025, unless they're good enough to be a QB2, and you have time to develop them and see what happens. I just think it works out perfectly for both sides. If it is a guy that, unless Mason's looking for an opportunity to be a starting quarterback, which maybe he is, and if any year was going to present that opportunity, it would be this year, to say there are so many teams out there that need a starter, and Mason stinks with Tennessee, but maybe he doesn't stink in New York. Maybe he doesn't stink with the Jets. Maybe he doesn't stink with the Giants. Who knows? And chances are they're not going to get much better, but there might be opportunity for him. I think it works out for both sides. I'd go get Mason Rudolph. I know a lot of people are going to say, don't go get Mason Rudolph. Screw Mason Rudolph. For a backup quarterback, I think you could do way worse than Mason Rudolph. And to be very honest, like, if your better option is Daniel Jones, you're wrong, because Daniel Jones is a shot in the dark. You have no idea if he's going to work out. You have none. You're taking a risk there. On a backup quarterback, you want to know what you're looking for? Stability. A guy that you know what you're going to get. You could care less if this guy is an 8-8 record as long as he could get you some wins when he's in there. That's Mason Rudolph. I'm full support of Mason Rudolph. I think this is a good move for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Wouldn't be surprised if it happened. I think it's more so Mason's side than like the Steelers could call Mason tomorrow. It's 100% if Mason hangs up the phone or not. That is where this goes to. So we'll see what happens. I like both of them. For the Flacco side of things, like you said, 40 years old. Not really much excitement left. I get it. He did some cool things in Cleveland, but who knows if that was just like a one-year splash. This is awesome. Didn't work out in New York. Didn't work out in Denver. I mean, maybe it just isn't. Maybe it's just over. Maybe it was just a one-year spark. He's not the worst name out there, but Flacco's a guy where I would go Daniel Jones. I would go Josh Dobbs. I would go a rookie before I went Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco's a guy that, like, you know, if he's still sitting there in week 2, maybe I'm calling him to come be on my practice squad. Hey, come hang out, you know, great. But I want to see what Skylar Thompson has before I'm giving the job to Joe Flacco as my backup quarterback in the summer. And that's where I stand there. We'll see what happens. But there'll be names. We'll toss this one in here too. Noah, hear me out. Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton would sit above Joe Flacco, significantly below Mason Rudolph in that middle tier, still think he's done type of situation. You put him anywhere else?
No, that's about right for Andy Dalton. I mean, he's younger than Joe Flacco, therefore he gets the bump over Joe Flacco. If Flacco was 5 years younger, I think it wouldn't be a question and he'd be over Andy Dalton. But that's a good, hey, listen, we're talking about backup quarterbacks here. So the question is, if your starter goes out for 3 weeks, who are you confident can get you to 2-1? And yes, that's what you're making the list off of. This is not a, hey, if they had to be your starting quarterback for a year, who would you want? Because if you have to have a backup be your starter for the year, then your expectations should have been thrown out the window weeks before. So this is who can get you to 2-1 in a 3-week stretch if need be. And if that's the case, I think you labeled Dalton perfectly there. And I think you kind of organized it in a way that most people would agree with.
Yeah. Don't you see like Mason Rudolph kind of just giving you like Nick Foles energy? Like he did it, man. Like who knows?
Nick Foles is tough energy to follow.
It is. Mason Rudolph, I don't know, man. I think he could pull it off.